Okay, this is going to be the second part of the first lecture. We started out, we looked at building trust, person-centered, with people suffering from opioid addiction, defenses, resistance. We moved on to CBT and REBT, how that fits the opioid addiction cycle, irrational thought processes, the ABCDEF model, and how to help the client deal with those difficult decisions. I don't want to forget reality or choice theory. And the reason choice theory fits into the larger picture of opioid addiction counseling or treatment is because of the basic needs and choices. When we talk about basic needs, originally based on Maslow's hierarchy of basic needs, but now, so we think about all of the safety and basic needs like, food, shelter, safety, things like that. Move on to power, freedom, fun, love, recreation. When we look at all of those basic human needs, a lot of them, if they are not being met, are often the result of choices that we make. Sometimes it is beyond our control as well, but the place of opioids and opioid addiction usually deals with a substitute for some of those higher needs that aren't being met. So when we think about love, belonging, we think about the feelings that go along with some of these higher order basic needs, such as a sense of well-being, a sense of belonging, a sense of fulfillment, lowered anxiety, peacefulness, contentment. All of these things are part of the euphoric nature of opioids. And of course, it's a chemical reaction. It's not an actual feeling. It's a substitution for something that people are searching. Whether it's self-medicating for a diagnosis to relieve anxiety or fear or whatever it might be, or a substitution for some of those higher order needs that everybody longs for. And later on, in other lectures this week, we're going to be talking about oxytocin, which is a chemical that's produced in our brains, and it's very similar, not just in chemical makeup, but in providing that sense of well-being, a sense of belonging, a sense that everything's okay. And a lot of times, when we think about discussing some of these things with clients, so much focus is placed on the addiction and the struggle with cravings and the choices we make, which is important. But a lot of times, it's a valid thing to talk about these other needs that clients are searching for, or have lost as a result of addiction or other things. So we can go through the basics of choice theory, but so are we making choices that are preventing us from getting those needs met? And of course, individuals are, but we have to look at the choices they made before the addiction process began, choices they made during the addiction process, and choices they're making now in recovery. Comparing those choices, talking about the needs that either were met before addiction or were not being met before addiction. Possibly addiction became a substitute for them. They might have lost some of these needs because of addiction, especially the ones that were related to relationships. And we have to kind of look at, okay, well, where is the client now? Do they need to identify poor choices not only that were being made as a result of addiction, but poor choices prior to addiction so that they're not repeated either? So we need to look beyond the mere process of addiction, because if we don't, they will continue to seek to fulfill those unmet needs in an unhealthy way. So that's why it's so important to look at both pre-addiction, addiction, and now post-addiction, not just addiction. But so much focus tends to be on that. I think that clients often find therapy much more helpful and meaningful if we move beyond the addiction. What would we be working on with this client if they did not have an addiction at all? If they came to see us as a general therapist, what would we be working on with that client? Well, a client who has an addiction, yes, they're dealing with all of those struggles, but they still have the same needs as they did before they had an addiction, and more now. So, addressing the choices that were being made prior to the addiction process, as well as the choices during addiction, and identifying which were resulting in positive life experiences and getting needs fulfilled and met, and which were not, because we want to help the client to move forward in a positive way, and not just forward from addiction, but to move forward in a positive way in life, so that all of those negative choices and results won't repeat themselves. And if they did repeat themselves, they might act as triggers in the addiction process. So it doesn't always happen, but I think it's so important to move beyond just the addiction to the bigger picture of the client's life, meaning, and purpose in general. So, as we move to those bigger questions, we begin to move into the theory I primarily use personally, and that's existential theory. The reason that resonates with me so much is that ultimately all of us as humans experience some universality in that we need to find a sense of purpose. We need to find meaning in our lives, and I believe that therapy is conducive to helping people do some self-examination and move forward in that journey, to make positive choices, to find more positive meaning. Many times, as we talked about in the very first lecture 5 weeks ago, people often search for meaning, but they're sidetracked. And the author of Dreamland talked about this as well. And so many things are substituted for purpose, meaning, what's considered success. And then it could be anything from job to money to a car to a house to whatever it might be, to an addiction. But something fills the need for purpose and meaning. But it is often a mere substitution. We get those immediate feelings and a sense of gratification, but it's not a long-term sense of fulfillment and gratification. We constantly look forward to the next promotion, the next raise, the next purchase, a larger house, a newer car, a cooler model of vehicle or clothes or whatever it might be, a new relationship rather than fixing an established relationship. We often substitute these things, and then ultimately, when people enter the addiction process and cycle, ultimately it becomes a much larger, all-encompassing substitution, and an even less meaningful one, because at some point, every person who experiences addiction realizes that they've been fooled. It's not genuine. The feelings that they experience are not genuine. And I often hear that expression, that they were fooled in some way. And what they would truly like to experience is genuine feeling of fulfillment, of well-being, of self-worth, of contentment, of lowered anxiety. They would like to deal with any comorbid diagnoses or issues or whatever else is going on. They would like to meet those basic needs: love, belonging, power, freedom, fun, safety, all of the basic needs. They would like to meet them in a meaningful way. And we all know that addiction, especially opioid addiction, is a highly selfish addiction. It really shifts the focus from empathy for others to personal wants. And of course, addicts see it as needs. And to some degree, there are physical needs when people move through withdrawal, but it's not a need for survival. It's not one of our basic needs. It's a need that is enhanced chemically. So ultimately, they are still searching for meaning and purpose. One of the interesting things about psychology and sociology and counseling and is that we tend to want clients to look introspectively, and I often looked at myself when I wanted to change in a positive way. That's all. People who have been heavily into an addiction, they have only thought about themselves and getting that next fix. So I think it's important to have a balance. A Jewish philosopher named Martin Buber wrote a book called I and Thou. And he talked about his own view of existential philosophy. And he called it I and Thou because there's multiple levels of I and Thou relationship, and ultimately it just means me and you. But in one sense, there is kind of the spiritual I and Thou, if an individual believes in a higher power. Even if it's agnosticism, something larger than oneself, kind of goes along with most 12-step programs. There's that sense. And in other courses, I even talk about belief systems, and even if people are atheists, it is still a belief in nothingness after one's death, and they find comfort in that, and that is still a belief system. It's not specifically a higher power, though. So that there is a differentiation. But that was one I-thou relationship. Some people seek that. Others don't. And that, I'm not going to judge them. The second I-thou relationship is finding one's relation to creation, the world, could be nature. So what is their often what is their place in the world? And often, because of an addiction, individuals feel disconnected with the world, isolated. And I've heard many, many stories about reconnection, especially with nature, and having that existential moment. An example of that would be when I was younger, I used to hike for weeks at a time on the Appalachian Trail, and when I was a young teenager, and one time I was just sitting in a campsite, and it had just rained, and I was in my tent, and I was reading, and a mist kind of filled the campsite, and I saw a large buck walk through the mists, and we stared at each other, and he didn't run away, he wasn't afraid, and we kind of acknowledged each other's presence. And then he walked on. But at that moment, I didn't only feel a connection with that deer, but I also felt a connection with the woods and the surroundings and the stream and everything. I felt connected, a part of. I no longer felt isolated. But I think a lot of times addiction is a truly isolating disease. And one of the things that Buber says is that there is no I without a thou. Addiction destroys relationships. And ultimately, we can provide support, but ultimately, people have to make choices, take responsibility at some point in this process. And even though they have to do that, we learn about ourselves through our experience of other. And that's the third type of I and thou relationship. So we have to include those things as part of therapy, as much as the client desires them. There is a loneliness and isolation and self-absorption in opioid addiction, and other addictions as well, but particularly opioid addiction. All of those deeper feelings have been replaced by chemical feelings. And when the chemicals are gone, then there is a true emptiness that our clients experience. I'd also like to combine some Adlerian theory with the existential theory, because a lot of times we encourage introspection in our clients, like I said, and we need to do that. We need to help our clients figure out, okay, these are the irrational thoughts, this is the rationalization, these are the defenses, this is what I'm self-medicating, these are, the whole gamut. Our clients have to be aware. We have to help to facilitate that awareness, which will result in positive change, hopefully. But on the other hand, because there's a selfishness in getting one's addiction needs met, or the next fix, or and that becomes one's objective, getting more drugs. There's a need to look beyond oneself, to help our clients to look beyond themselves. So Adler created a concept called Gemeinschaftsgefühl, which simply means community feeling. And he recommended becoming involved in some type of community volunteer work, primarily doing something beyond oneself, looking beyond oneself. for a number of reasons. Uh, Individuals feel good when we do for others. We are no longer solely thinking about ourselves. It lowers anxiety and depression. It connects us, and we're no longer isolated. It builds a support network. We feel a part of a community or an organization or a group. It gets us out of an apartment, so we're not isolating. So it's that human connection, a looking beyond ourselves. And a lot of times, people who are struggling with an addiction want to help other people who are experiencing an addiction. But I always recommend something totally different until somebody has been in recovery for an extended period of time. So, for instance, why not do something like feeding the elderly who are homebound? Something where it's totally different than dealing with addiction. Something that would not lead to temptation or relapse, but something different than addiction that helps to move them beyond themselves. One other thing I would like to talk about is a theory that I developed that has to do with death anxiety and grief and loss, but it can be applied to any aspect of life, not just death anxiety or grief and loss. And it's called regret theory. And I find that when clients are sober and they look back on a period of addiction, active use, there are a lot of regrets. And the theory, the model really talks about a few different types of regrets. 2 regrets from the past and 1 future-related regret. So, one type of regret that I find clients experience in addiction is a regret of committal or commission. So they did things that they wish they hadn't. And you can think of some obvious things. Maybe they stole something, maybe they took money from their family, something like that. But there are more subtle things like manipulation of people they love, breaking trust, doing things that resulted in disappointment or sadness, harming other people emotionally, physically. The second type of past-related regret is a regret of omission. Things we wish we had done, but we did not do. So they omitted saying, I love you, I'm sorry, things like that. What do they wish they had done that they didn't do? Gotten help sooner. But, and then a future-related regret is often very profound as well. What could have been, but is not. Everything from relationships to careers to sports. So many possibilities that are no longer And that's not to say that things are not possible. It's usually very specific possibilities that they regret. So we process the regrets, but we don't stay in the past. We move to the present, and we discuss what the client has learned as a result of the mistakes. And we humanize the mistakes because every human makes mistakes. And every human has the potential to change as a result of what they have learned from those mistakes. We are no longer the same person we were when we made those mistakes. We've grown, hopefully, in some positive way. Who are we now that we have learned from our mistakes? And how will we change in a positive way? So, personal growth is key in processing regret as a result of addiction. I think that's a nice general idea of how I might incorporate classical theory and regret theory as well in this process. And hopefully it took you beyond solely addiction to the larger human picture that we all share and experience, including those who are struggling with addiction. Sometimes looking at that bigger picture helps people to better deal with the struggle of addiction. Okay. In the next video, we will move forward to some new theoretical interventions.